Over 3,000 years ago, an unstoppable storm swept across the Mediterranean world. Cities that had once flourished were left in ruins. Kingdoms that had been centers of trade, culture, and power vanished as if they had never existed. In the few surviving records, one chilling phrase appears again and again: invaders from the sea. Who were they? The ancients called them the Sea Peoples, strange warriors sailing unfamiliar ships, wielding weapons no one had ever seen before, and speaking languages no one could understand. No one knew where they came from, but their sudden arrival shook the entire known world. Even today, their story is shrouded in mystery. Their origins remain uncertain, their motives unknown, their true identity seemingly erased from history itself. All we know comes from the fragments left behind by the civilizations that faced them, those who endured the terror they brought. Were they waves of displaced migrants fleeing from collapsing homelands, ruthless bands of pirates exploiting weakness, or an organized military force determined to tear down the old world order? More than 3,000 years have passed, yet the question remains unanswered. Archaeologists still search for scattered evidence, historians still debate endlessly, and perhaps hidden deep beneath the sands of time, the truth lies buried about one of the greatest mysteries of the ancient world. This is the story of the Sea Peoples, and of an age they plunged into darkness and oblivion. Tonight, join Bedtime History as we follow the trail of nameless ships, unfamiliar warriors, and forgotten chapters of the past to uncover a tale that has never been fully told, the story of the Sea Peoples, who they were, and why their shadow continues to haunt human history to this very day. To understand why their arrival sent shockwaves through the ancient world, we must first imagine what the Mediterranean looked like before the storm. It was a world of wealth, connection, and fragile balance. Between the 14th and early 13th centuries, BCE, the Mediterranean and Near East entered an age of remarkable development. Civilizations thrived not only in technology and economy, but also in deep interconnection through trade and diplomacy. To the south, Egypt's new kingdom under pharaohs like Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, and Seti stood at its height. Monumental temples rose along the Nile, testifying to immense power and ambition. Egyptian ships sailed across distant waters, bringing back cedar from Lebanon, copper from Cyprus, and exotic goods from the legendary land of Punt. To the north, across Anatolia, the Hittite Empire ruled from its fortified capital at Hattusa. They controlled key trade routes linking the Near East with the Balkans. Skilled in warfare and diplomacy, they left behind extensive archives revealing a world bound by treaties, commerce, and negotiation. To the west, Mycenaean civilization dominated the Greek mainland. Cities like Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos rose as fortified strongholds. These were powerful states capable of mobilizing vast armies, famed for advanced metallurgy, and led by elites who lived in palatial splendor. Mycenaean ships carried wine, olive oil, pottery, and weapons across the Mediterranean. To the east, the Levantine ports, Ugarit, Byblos, and Sidon, flourished as vital links in this network. Ugarit especially thrived as a hub of trade and culture, even giving birth to the world's first true alphabet, the ancestor of many modern scripts. Further south, the land of Canaan prospered under the shadow of empires, its people actively engaged in coastal trade, feeding goods into the wider markets. What tied all these centers together was not only power or wealth, but a vast network of trade routes by sea and land that served as the lifeblood of the Bronze Age world. On great ships, essential resources like copper and tin for bronze flowed endlessly. Archaeologists have uncovered wrecks such as the Uluburun of modern-day Turkey, filled with treasures from across the ancient world, proof of this interconnection. But this very dependence was also a fatal weakness. When trade routes faltered, when even a single link in the chain broke, the entire system risked collapse. Many civilizations, though mighty on the surface, were built on fragile foundations of centralized authority, making them vulnerable to sudden shocks. No one could have imagined that in just a few decades, a force from across the seas would bring this interconnected order crashing down, sparking one of the greatest collapses in human history. At the heart of this thriving world was the bronze trade itself, the essential foundation of the age. Imagine a ship leaving the port of Ugarit on a calm morning. Its decks are loaded with barrels of precious copper from Cyprus. Alongside them lie rare ingots of tin, sourced from Anatolia, the Caucasus, or perhaps even the distant British Isles. Together, copper and tin formed bronze, the metal upon which armies, economies, and even artistry depended. Without it, weapons, armor, tools, and jewelry would disappear. This was the lifeblood of empires. Yet these ships carried more than just metals. There were cedar logs from Lebanon used for warships, palace beams, and royal coffins. Gold from Nubia, gems from Sinai, aromatic resins from Arabia, and the prized purple dye made from sea snails coveted by kings of the East. These vessels connected Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, Greece, and the Aegean Islands. In Hattusa, the Hittites imported tin and horses while exporting fine textiles and early iron goods. In Mycenae, treasures buried in royal tombs reveal artifacts from as far as Egypt and Cyprus, evidence of a vibrant global exchange. Each merchant and each ship was a single link in this immense chain. But the network carried more than goods. It spread ideas, religions, technologies, and myths. The alphabet of Ugarit, advances in metallurgy, and the legends of gods and heroes all travelled along these sea routes. But the same deep interdependence that brought prosperity also meant vulnerability. When tin supplies failed, when pirates attacked ships, or when wars disrupted trade, the consequences rippled across civilizations. Looking back, we cannot overlook the central role of bronze, the alloy that defined an entire age. Without it, there would have been no weapons for armies, no tools for builders, no ornaments for kings. Bronze was the foundation of this great interconnected world, the very strength and, ultimately, the fatal weakness of the age. And it was on this fragile stage that the Sea Peoples arrived, bringing with them chaos that would end the Bronze Age forever. And why did an entire age depend so heavily on a single alloy? At that time, iron had not yet been mastered on a large or dependable scale. Bronze, a blend of copper and tin, was the indispensable material of the era. It forged swords, spears, arrowheads, and armor, but also the tools that sustained farming, building, and daily life. Without bronze, armies lost their strength in war. Craftsmen could no longer produce fine goods. Trade and production would grind to a standstill. Yet here lay the critical problem. Copper and tin were not evenly spread across the Mediterranean and Near East. To keep supplies steady, kingdoms relied on vast and complicated trade routes that wound across lands and seas, passing through countless hands before reaching their destination. Cyprus was the Bronze Age's great copper mine, but tin, far rarer, had to be brought in from afar. Some came from Anatolia or from rugged lands farther east. Some scholars even argue that part of the tin supply travelled all the way from Central Europe or the distant British Isles through perilous networks of merchants and caravans. Because of this, no single kingdom could stand alone. Each depended on others for survival. International connections were not luxuries, they were necessities. The pharaohs of Egypt built careful ties with the kings of the Hittites. Mycenaean city-states struggled for control over sea routes. Cities like Ugarit became bustling crossroads where traders from every corner of the known world met to exchange goods and news. We know this not only from archaeological finds, but also from surviving records, clay tablets from Elamana and Ugarit that describe kings sending gold, copper, horses, skilled artisans, and even royal relatives to secure alliances. Yet such deep reliance on trade carried a hidden danger. If one source of tin went dry, if a caravan was blocked, if a fleet was stopped by pirates or war, the consequences rippled outward. Collapse could spread like fire through the entire system. Modern scholars often compare this world to the earliest form of a global economy, and like any global economy, it thrived when every part worked together, but it was frighteningly fragile in the face of sudden shocks. Few in the Bronze Age could imagine how quickly those shocks were building, and when they came, they would topple the world faster than anyone thought possible. No matter how shrewd the kings were, no matter how vast their network stretched, there were powers they could not command. And the first signs of trouble came quietly from nature itself. Modern studies of ice cores, tree rings, and lake sediments show that during the late 13th and early 12th centuries, BCE, the Mediterranean, and Near East entered a time of violent climate instability. Long droughts ravaged crops, especially in regions that relied on farming such as Canaan, the Levant, and even Upper Egypt. Tree rings from Anatolia reveal years of poor growth, proof of severe water shortages. Sediments from lakes in the Levant confirm sharp declines in rainfall, patterns that align with records of unrest in ancient texts. In kingdoms that depended on farmland and imported grain shipped across the sea, the pressure mounted. Food grew scarce, prices soared, hunger spread through the villages and fields, the same fields that had long provided soldiers and laborers for royal courts. But the troubles did not stop there. The earth itself turned against them. Fault lines shifted. Tremors shook cities. Archaeological evidence reveals that Ugarit, Hattusa, Mycenae, and other centers suffered devastating earthquakes just before or during waves of violent attacks. Walls fell not by enemy hands but by the shaking ground. Storehouses collapsed. Temples once majestic were reduced to rubble. In an age when a king's authority rested on his ability to guard his people from nature's wrath, these disasters delivered a crushing blow to both faith and order. The despair of the time is captured in clay tablets unearthed at Ugarit. These letters, written in urgent strokes, tell of food shortages, riots, and waves of migrants fleeing ruined lands. The system, so tightly woven, was tearing apart. In this chaos, failed harvests, quakes, hunger, and unrest, the sea peoples emerged. But were they the cause of collapse, or merely the outcome of a world already breaking down? That question remains unanswered even today. Perhaps the most vivid window into this unraveling comes not from ruins or fault lines, but from the trembling words left on clay. At Ugarit, a wealthy trade hub on the Levantine coast, more than 1,000 tablets have been recovered, recording treaties, shipments, and royal exchanges. Among them are messages that still chill the reader. One, sent from the king of Ugarit to the king of Cyprus as enemies closed in, reads, "The enemy is at the gates. My city is in dire straits. Send reinforcements and food at once, if possible. If not, I fear Ugarit will not survive." These are not the polished phrases of diplomacy, but the gasps of a ruler facing doom. Other letters show the system collapsing in real time. In one message to the king of Alashia, Cyprus, the ruler of Ugarit laments that merchant ships can no longer dock, pirates patrol the seas, and shipments of copper and tin have ceased to arrive. What had once been a smooth network of trade was now shattered. Military supplies dwindled, grain ran out, armies shrank, and the letters reveal how the tone of kings themselves shifted. In earlier correspondence, kings wrote in confident formality, arranging marriages, offering gifts, speaking as equals. But in the final messages from Ugarit just before the city's destruction, the tone is stripped of ceremony. They are letters of fear, begging for help, pleading for food, written in voices as fragile as any commoner's. And then Ugarit fell. When its ruins were uncovered, many of these clay tablets were still lying on writing tables, never sent. Messages frozen in time, cut short by disaster. These final unsent letters stand as silent witnesses to a world in collapse. In every pressed line of cuneiform, we can still hear the breath of an age gasping its last. And it was at this very moment that the Sea Peoples emerged from the shadows, whether as agents of collapse or as symbols of the end of a once glorious age. It is almost impossible to imagine that only a few years before those desperate pleas were hastily pressed onto clay tablets, the cities of the Mediterranean still thrived in an atmosphere of wealth, confidence, and dazzling prosperity. Ugarit, for instance, was not merely a busy seaport, but a thriving cultural center. In the elegant homes of its merchants and nobles, one would have seen fine pottery, intricate figurines, and jewelry of gold and silver on display, proof of a society that prized beauty and spared no expense in adorning their lives. Ships constantly sailed in and out of its harbors, and its bustling markets overflowed with silk, spices, glass, and metals brought from the farthest reaches of the known world. Skilled artisans painted gods and legends onto walls, reflecting the deep pride and vibrancy of their culture. Hattusa, the capital of the mighty Hittite Empire, was no less grand. Its vast temples and monumental gates of stone loomed with strength and majesty, adorned with intricate carvings. Inside its palaces, scribes recorded treaties and decrees with the confidence of rulers who believed they commanded both time and history. In the West, the Mycenaean city-states revolved around their great palaces where frescoes painted vivid hunting scenes, bold rituals, and daring voyages across the sea. Mycenaean warriors clad in polished bronze armor marched in festivals, honoring their ancestors and affirming the might of their people. Even common citizens, though not wealthy, benefited from this globally connected world. They wore finer fabrics, used better tools, and enjoyed access to goods that once were reserved only for kings and nobles. Religious ceremonies continued as they always had, solemn processions with priests offering lavish gifts to the gods, acts of devotion but also of power, a display of each city's wealth. Above all, what people shared most deeply was a profound faith in the permanence of their world order. Kings proudly carved victories into stone. Merchants sent ships across seas with confidence. Ordinary men and women lived with the belief that their civilization, with all its brilliance, would endure for generations. No one suspected that in only a few years it would all vanish into flame and ruin. Mighty fortresses would fall to fire. Trade routes would shatter. Festivals, once filled with music and joy, would be drowned out by cries of terror. And so when we read the final desperate letters of Ugarit, or when we stand among the broken stones of Mycenae and Hattusa today, we see more than ruins. We feel the sorrow of a world once alive with confidence and beauty, now silenced, reduced to echoes of a golden age that slipped away. Amid this brilliance, faint warnings appeared, not through great wars, but carved into stone as if whispered from the past. The earliest record of the Sea Peoples comes from a monument known as the Merneptah Stele, raised around 1207 BCE in Egypt. Pharaoh Merneptah, son of the famed Ramses II, faced unrest on both Egypt's eastern and western frontiers. The inscriptions celebrate his victories, but buried among accounts of defeating Libyan and Meshwesh tribes in the west lies a detail that would open the door to one of history's greatest mysteries. The text reads, "Canaan has been plundered, Ashkelon has been captured, Gaza has been seized, Yanoam is no more, and Israel lies desolate, its seed destroyed. The Shurdan, Shekelesh, Ekwesh, Luka, and Teresh, those who came from the sea, have been crushed. They are no longer a threat to Egypt. Those names, Shurdan, Shekelesh, Ekwesh, Luka, and Teresh, would echo through time as clues to the origins of the sea peoples. What stands out most is the phrase, "those who came from the sea." It is precise yet mysterious. Nowhere in Egypt's long records do we find these groups mentioned before. They were not the traditional enemies Egypt had always faced. To scholars today, they appear as new arrivals on the historical stage, migrants or warrior coalitions pushed into motion by the era's mounting crises. And the fact that Egyptian scribes recorded them in such a significant inscription is telling. Pharaohs were deliberate about what victories they carved into stone. For these unknown peoples to appear here means they were seen as a threat worthy of memory, a sign their presence was no longer minor. Even more striking, the stele links their appearance to the destruction of Canaanite cities, showing that their impact stretched far beyond Egyptian borders. They were not isolated raiders. They were shaking the fragile foundations of the entire Eastern Mediterranean, where trade, politics, and diplomacy were already under immense strain. In those few lines, we can sense the first waves of a storm that no power could fully control. But this was only the beginning. Within a generation, these sea-wandering peoples would grow bolder. They would no longer strike only as raiders, but as migrating hosts, whole communities with men, women, children, and carts of possessions, moving not simply to plunder, but to claim new lands. And their arrival would redraw the political and economic map of the region for centuries to come. What Merneptah's stele hinted at as a warning would soon become a cataclysm. Less than 30 years later, Egypt itself faced the full force of this storm. Around 1175 BC, during the reign of Pharaoh Ramses III, one of the greatest battles in Egyptian history erupted. Thanks to the vivid reliefs carved on the walls of the Medinet Habu temple in Thebes, we can still see this clash unfold in astonishing detail more than 3,000 years later. On those walls, time seems almost frozen. Entire fleets from across the sea appear, not just with warriors, but with families and wagons, migrating communities seeking new homes. They were no longer shadowy raiders. They were a people on the move. According to Ramses III's inscriptions, this great coalition included groups named the Peleset, Cheker, Shekelesh, Denian, and Weshesh. Their origins remain debated even now, with scholars tracing connections to the Aegean, Anatolia, and beyond. The reliefs show their ships, large, broad-sailed vessels with many oars, skillfully built for both transport and war. Their warriors are marked by strange horned and conical helmets, round shields, and weapons unlike those of the Egyptians, clear evidence of a distinct culture, organized and prepared for conflict on a massive scale. But Ramses III was ready. He had prepared Egypt for this moment. He positioned ambushes along the delta's shores, stationed archers and infantry at river mouths, and filled the Nile's branches with warships. When the sea peoples advanced, their ships were caught in shallow waters, hemmed in by Egyptian forces on both banks. The reliefs depict fierce fighting, arrows raining down, ships overturned, bodies floating in the water, and captives dragged ashore. In his inscriptions, Ramses III declared total victory. "Those who came from the sea, I have hurled them back into the sea." His words ring with triumph, but the carved scenes tell us even more. They reveal the moment when the sea peoples burst into history, no longer whispers in inscriptions, but a visible storm clashing with one of the most powerful empires of the ancient world. They lie scattered across the sands. None remained alive to carry the tale back home. Yet behind these triumphant words carved in stone lies an undeniable truth. This was not some fleeting raid upon Egypt's shores. It was a desperate migration on a vast scale, a collision between the armies of Egypt and a wave of uprooted peoples seeking not mere loot, but new lands where they might survive. And though Ramesses III boasted of his victory, Egypt itself did not escape unharmed. Its foothold in the Levant, long a symbol of Egyptian power abroad, was lost forever after this crisis. Its influence over foreign kingdoms shrank. At home, the economy faltered under the burden of war. The stability that had once defined the Nile's kingdom had been shaken, and this was but one chapter in a far greater story. For while Egypt endured, though wounded, many of its neighbors could not. The tide of the sea peoples rolled on across the Mediterranean, leaving behind burned cities, toppled palaces, and civilization shattered beyond repair. As we gaze upon the reliefs at Medinet Habu today, we see far more than depictions of battle. We see the very hinge of history turning, an old order crumbling, and a new, fragile, uncertain world rising out of the ashes. From the Merneptah stele, from the walls of Medinet Habu, and from scattered fragments of surviving records, scholars have pieced together a haunting list of names: Sherden, Shekelesh, Peliset, Checker, Denian, Luca, each name strange, each echoing like a riddle whispered across time. What is most striking is this: not a single inscription written by the sea peoples themselves has ever been found. They left no chronicles, no letters, no maps. All that we know of them comes from the accounts of their enemies, chiefly the Egyptians, who preserved their struggles with meticulous detail. Let us look more closely at these mysterious groups. The Sherden, described as fierce warriors, are shown with horned helmets, round shields, and fine armor. Some believe they came from Sardinia, where echoes of similar culture appear in ancient remains, but no proof is certain. The Shekelesh bear a name that recalls Sicily, though this too rests on speculation, for no clear trail ties them to the island. The Peliset are perhaps the least shadowed of all. Many historians see in them the ancestors of the Philistines, who later settled along the Canaanite coast, raising cities like Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ashdod. Archaeology supports this, revealing a new Aegean-flavored culture arriving in the land: pottery, houses, and weapons distinctly unlike those of the native Canaanites. The Checker are known only from their settlement in Dor, a Levantine port. Of their homeland before this migration, nothing is known. The Danaan are among the most debated. Some scholars link them with the Danaoi, a term the Greeks themselves once used for the Mycenaeans. If this is true, then among the sea peoples marched fragments of Greece itself. But this too remains no more than a theory. The Luca are often tied to Lycia in Anatolia, a rugged land with seafarers and raiders long known in history. Were these the same people? The answer is lost. What binds all these names together is mystery. No map points to a kingdom of the Sherden. No chronicle names a homeland of the Denian. No city claims to have birthed the Peliset before they appeared on Canaan's coast. The sea peoples remain faceless, their origins blurred, their story told only by those who feared them. Were they scattered tribes forced together by famine and drought, or an organized confederation bent on conquest? The truth is still unknown. And it is this very uncertainty that keeps their story alive, wrapped in the aura of a forbidden mystery at the core of the ancient world. Yet what impressed the ancients most, and still stirs us today, was not only the names, but the images left carved in stone. On the walls of Medinet Habu, the warriors of the sea peoples stride in vivid detail. Egyptian scribes, accustomed to depicting foes like Libyans or Canaanites, gave these new enemies a look entirely foreign. The helmets stand out most of all. Some show great horns jutting upward. Others carry wide brims with tall crests unlike anything seen in Egypt's armies. These helmets were not simply practical. They bore symbols of identity, of culture, of pride. Were they marks of leaders alone, or a tradition shared by all? That debate endures even now. Round shields hang at their arms, some flat, some convex, often marked with a central boss of metal. Such shields were familiar in the Aegean and Anatolia, yet foreign to Egyptians, who carried long ovals or rectangles. Their swords were short, double-edged, sharp for close combat. Daggers flashed at their belts. Spears were ready to hurl. And in some carvings we see leaf-shaped blades, nearly identical to those dug from Mycenaean graves. Their clothing, too, was distinct. Short, fringed skirts, bare legs, light sandals. Perfect attire for leaping from ships in coastal raids. For fighting with speed and mobility to Egyptians, these figures must have seemed like beings from another world, armed, dressed, and moving unlike any rival they had ever faced. And it was precisely this difference that confirmed their identity as outsiders, voyagers from faraway lands whose ways were utterly alien. Even now, archaeologists sift through the evidence. In Sardinia, in Sicily, in Lycia, in Greece, traces of helmets, blades, pottery, each compared to the images carved in Medinet Habu's stone. But the puzzle remains unsolved. Every fragment is a piece, but the whole picture still eludes us. When we stand before the Merneptah stele or walk among the reliefs of Medinet Habu, one thing becomes clear. The Sea Peoples were not a passing storm, but a force that reshaped the ancient world. And though their names still hang in mystery, their shadow stretches across history, whispering of a time when empires fell and a new age was born. The Sea Peoples were not simply passing shadows in the annals of history. They were a force powerful enough to be etched into Egyptian stone and numerous enough to spark one of the greatest upheavals of the late Bronze Age. But who exactly were they? This is the question that has kept historians debating for more than a century. Two dominant theories have taken shape. Were they little more than daring bands of pirates? Or were they part of a massive, organized migration that helped topple the interconnected world of the Mediterranean? The first theory, piracy, draws support from Egyptian accounts of their earliest encounters with the Sea Peoples. Swift raids from fast-moving ships, sudden strikes on coastal settlements, plunder seized and carried away before defenders could muster. Such tactics matched the style of organized piracy that was already widespread in the ancient Mediterranean. Groups like the Luca, tied to Lycia, a region long associated with seafaring warriors and raiders, seem to support this interpretation. And yet the evidence complicates this picture. If they were only pirates, why do the reliefs of Ramesses III show women, children, and entire communities on the move? Why, during their great assault on Egypt, did the Sea Peoples drag wagons of possessions, livestock, and tents across the land? Such details point not to raiders, but to migrants, entire societies on the march. This leads to the second theory, now favored by many scholars, that the Sea Peoples represented an organized wave of migration driven by crisis. Climate disaster, years of drought, devastating earthquakes, the collapse of once thriving trade networks, all of these factors rendered homelands unlivable. Communities from Anatolia, the Aegean, and perhaps even farther west may have been forced to abandon their lands, carrying families and wealth in search of survival. When met with resistance, migration turned into violence, raids into wars, and desperation into conquest. It may be in this light that the Sea Peoples should be remembered, not only as plunderers, but as displaced peoples, determined to carve out a future in a world collapsing around them. Even so, the mystery remains. Perhaps they were not one thing or another. Perhaps they were a blend of many, pirates and refugees, mercenaries and migrants, united only by circumstance. It is this complexity that makes them so elusive and so captivating. To understand them, we must examine every theory, every surviving inscription, every archaeological clue. And the deeper we dig, the clearer it becomes that history is not yet ready to yield all of its secrets. Debate may continue about who the Sea Peoples were, but what they left behind is beyond dispute, and no city illustrates their impact more vividly than Ugarit. Perched on the northern coast of the Levant, in what is now modern Syria, Ugarit was one of the Bronze Age's great commercial hubs. From its harbours, ships sailed across the Mediterranean, bearing copper, tin, cedarwood, glass, textiles, and luxury goods of every kind. The city was rich and sophisticated. It gave the world the Ugaritic alphabet, one of humanity's earliest writing systems, a script that influenced the Phoenicians and, in turn, the alphabets we use today. Its royal palace was immense, its archives filled with clay tablets documenting treaties, trade, and diplomacy. In these records, historians see the vibrant life of a city that once stood at the very heart of an international world. But in an instant, it was gone. The final letters of Ugarit's king, as we saw earlier, reflect a desperate plea as enemy forces, believed to be the Sea Peoples, closed in. Then silence. Excavations at Ras Shamra, the site of Ugarit, reveal the story. A layer of ash covering the entire city, walls toppled, bricks scorched, tablets fused together in fire. What is most striking is that Ugarit never rose again. No rebuilding, no resettlement. It was left abandoned, its glory erased forever. Archaeologists even found half-finished tablets in kilns, letters still on desks unsent, frozen in time as if the attack had struck without warning. It speaks to the violence and speed of the destruction and to the helplessness of Ugarit's rulers against the oncoming tide. With its fall, a vital link in the Mediterranean trade network was severed. The economy of the entire region, so dependent on interwoven routes, buckled. When we look at Ugarit's charred walls and shattered tablets today, we feel the weight of that loss. Here was a center of wealth and creativity erased in a single stroke, as though it had never existed. And Ugarit was only one among many. The tide rolled on, and with it more cities vanished into history's shadows. If Ugarit shows us the Sea People's destructive power upon coastal hubs, then the fate of Hattusa, the Hittite capital, reveals something darker still. Set deep in the Anatolian plateau, Hattusa was once the seat of an empire. The Hittites ruled wide domains from Anatolia to the Levant, rivaling Egypt in war and in diplomacy. The city itself sprawled across a vast landscape, girded by massive stone walls, its gates adorned with monumental carvings, its palaces filled with royal archives. Over 30,000 clay tablets have been unearthed there, detailing laws, treaties, prayers, and the machinery of empire, and yet, around 1200 to 1190 BCE, Hattusa was suddenly abandoned. Its walls and buildings show scars of fire and collapse. But here lies the mystery. No Egyptian record ever speaks of the Sea Peoples striking Hattusa directly, and yet the timing is too precise to dismiss. As the Sea Peoples swept across the Mediterranean, toppling kingdoms and shattering trade, Hattusa collapsed too. Some scholars suggest that the empire, already reeling from drought, famine, and attacks by mountain tribes, was pushed past the breaking point by the wider chaos. The final Hittite letters bear an eerie resemblance to those from Ugarit, urgent pleas for aid, unanswered, lost to time. What is certain is this: Hattusa never rose again. The empire of the Hittites, once Egypt's equal, disappeared from the map. In its place came a world of fractured kingdoms, wandering peoples, and a landscape defined by instability. Did the Sea Peoples strike Hattusa themselves, or did their disruption unravel the empire from afar? We may never know, but the shadow of their presence, direct or indirect, hung heavy over the city's fall, and that shadow only grew as the tide pressed on, reshaping the dying Bronze Age world city by city, empire by empire, leaving behind ruins where civilizations once thrived. As Hattusa lay silent in ashes, the wave of crisis did not stop in Anatolia. It rolled westward across the Aegean Sea and struck at the very heart of the Mycenaean world, the Greek civilization of the late Bronze Age. The Mycenaean civilization, famed for its cities such as Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, and Thebes, was one of the Aegean's strongest commercial and military powers. Its towering cyclopean walls, fortified palaces, and treasures buried in royal tombs reveal a society both wealthy and sophisticated. The Mycenaean system of rule revolved around great palace complexes where the wanax, the king, directed the economy, military, religious rituals, and diplomacy. Their trade network stretched across the Mediterranean, linking them with Egypt, Anatolia, and the Levant. And yet, by the late 13th to early 12th century BCE, one Mycenaean city after another collapsed. At Mycenae itself, excavations show thick layers of ash covering entire districts, unmistakable evidence of a massive citywide fire. Granaries, armories, and homes all reveal simultaneous destruction. Pylos, one of the greatest administrative centers of the Mycenaean world, suffered the same fate. At the palace of Nestor, clay tablets from its archives were baked hard by the flames, allowing archaeologists to read them centuries later. Ironically, one of the final surviving tablets records urgent orders to mobilize troops and warships, proof that the attack came swiftly while the city still scrambled to prepare its defenses. At Tiryns, one of the most heavily fortified Mycenaean strongholds, the story is the same: collapsed walls and scorched ruins. The entire palace system, which had been the backbone of Mycenaean power, unraveled within only a few decades. What is most striking is that these cities never fully recovered. There were no large-scale reconstructions. The Mycenaean civilization, so dependent on its tightly connected palace economy, proved unable to rise again. Some scholars argue that these destructions were the result of internal revolt or rebellion. But when we compare their timing with the movements of the Sea Peoples through the Levant and Egypt, and when we consider the Mycenaean records concerning naval defenses, many believe the Sea Peoples were directly or indirectly involved. In the aftermath, the entire Mycenaean world spiraled into decline. Linear Bay script, once used by the ruling class, disappeared. International trade collapsed. City-states broke apart into isolated, self-sufficient villages. From this void emerged the so-called Greek Dark Age, a period of cultural regression that lasted centuries before Greece would rise again in the archaic and classical periods. Looking at the charred ruins of Pylos or Mycenae today, it is difficult not to shudder at the scale of the fall. A civilization that had once challenged the greatest powers of the age was brought down in fire, and though Greek records do not name the Sea Peoples explicitly, their shadow lingers, an unstoppable tide sweeping across all it touched. As the Mycenaean world collapsed in the Aegean, to the east in the land of Canaan, the Sea Peoples left marks not only of destruction, but of transformation. Canaan, stretching from the southern coast of the Levant north toward Byblos, was a thriving region of bustling cities such as Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gaza, and Giza. These Canaanite centers prospered through trade with Egypt, the Hittites, and the Mycenaeans, serving as intermediaries across the Mediterranean's great routes. But by the late 13th century BCE, archaeological evidence reveals that sweeping change struck the region. Among the Sea Peoples who arrived here, the most significant were the Peliset, widely identified by scholars as the ancestors of the Philistines, later so prominent in biblical history. Egyptian reliefs at Medinet Habu depict the Peliset as a central force in the great invasions against Egypt. Unlike some other groups, however, the Peliset were not eradicated. After their defeat, a portion of them settled permanently along the Canaanite coast. Excavations at Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gaza show a sudden new layer of habitation beginning around 1200 BCE, coinciding exactly with the Sea Peoples' migrations. The material culture of this new layer is strikingly different from that of the native Canaanites. Pottery styles reflect late Aegean traditions. Architecture, burial customs, even dietary habits reveal the presence of a foreign seafaring people. Out of this community arose the Philistines, remembered in later centuries as adversaries of the Israelites. Their arrival reshaped the entire demographic and cultural balance of the Levant. While the Canaanites endured, in many areas, they were gradually displaced or assimilated by these newcomers. Archaeological finds demonstrate that the Philistines quickly developed a thriving economy, restored broken trade networks, and forged a unique identity that blended their maritime origins with local culture. This reveals a vital truth about the Sea Peoples. They were not only destroyers, they were also settlers and builders. Some groups chose to adapt and contribute to the cultural fabric of the lands they entered, leaving marks that endured for millennia. Thus, while the palaces of the Mycenaeans burned, while Hattusa and Ugarit lay in ruins, a new chapter opened in Canaan, written by the Peliset upon the coastal plains they came to inhabit. Yet perhaps the greatest consequence of the Sea Peoples' tide was not the fall of individual cities, but the collapse of the entire international network that had bound the Bronze Age world together. For nearly 2 centuries before, an intricate system of trade linked Egypt, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, Ugarit, Cyprus, Canaan, Anatolia, and beyond. This early global economy depended on the steady movement of copper and tin, the essential ingredients of bronze, as well as cedar, ivory, gold, silver, textiles, glass, wine, and oil. Merchant fleets sailed constantly across the Mediterranean, weaving together a fragile but thriving web of economic exchange. Within only a few decades, this system collapsed completely. The fleets of the Sea Peoples severed sea routes and besieged coastal ports. Ugarit was destroyed, Byblos fell into decline, and Alashiya, modern Cyprus, the Mediterranean's great source of copper, was thrown into chaos by repeated assaults. With the flow of copper and tin disrupted, the production of bronze weapons and tools faltered. Palace economies, utterly dependent on this trade, could not survive the shock. Letters from Ugarit and Pylos show city officials still desperately trying to assemble convoys and request aid even as the flames closed in, but it was too late. The trade system had become unstable beyond repair. The results were catastrophic. Diplomatic treaties, once carved in stone, collapsed overnight as partners vanished or could no longer uphold them. International alliances disintegrated. The palatial economies, reliant on foreign imports, imploded. Across the eastern Mediterranean, civilizations that had flourished for centuries entered a dark and chaotic age. Aristocrats lost their authority. Skilled artisans were stripped of their livelihoods. Entire populations were driven back into the harsh reality of subsistence living. Roads that once pulsed with trade fell silent. Warehouses that had overflowed with goods now stood hollow and abandoned. Harbors that had once echoed with the bargaining cries of merchants were reduced to crumbling docks and weather-beaten posts left lonely against the tide. For this reason, many historians describe this collapse as one of the earliest and clearest failures of globalization. A world so deeply interconnected, once thought strong and unshakable, revealed itself to be fragile when faced with sudden and sweeping upheaval. And when the dust settled, the Mediterranean world, as it had been known, no longer existed. In its place rose a fractured, local, and uncertain order, a dark age that would take centuries for humanity to recover from. As the Mediterranean descended into this chaos, the question of who the Sea Peoples truly were grew increasingly urgent for modern scholars. One of the most compelling theories points to the displaced Mycenaeans. After the collapse of their civilization, many believed that segments of the Mycenaean population joined the migrations and raids of the Sea Peoples across the Mediterranean. This argument rests on a series of notable observations. Between roughly 1200 and 1150 BCE, the great Mycenaean palace centers were destroyed one by one. The social order collapsed, the aristocracy was stripped of its foundation, and entire communities were cut off from the imported goods and foods they had once depended upon. In such an environment, countless Mycenaean groups had no choice but to abandon their former homes in search of survival. Archaeological records show that once the palace system fell, populations in the Peloponnesian plains dropped dramatically. Coastal settlements and Aegean islands, once thriving, were suddenly abandoned. Yet, in new regions like the Levantine coast, fresh layers of habitation emerged, bearing distinctly Aegean traits in pottery, architecture, and burial customs. Even more intriguing is the appearance of the name Denian in Egyptian records of the Sea Peoples. Many connect it to the term Danaoi, later used by the Greeks themselves to describe the Mycenaeans. From this link, many scholars argue that displaced Mycenaeans did not merely wait to perish, but joined with other wandering groups, forming armed migrant bands that sought new lands by force. Yet this theory is not without its difficulties. No direct evidence suggests that the Sea Peoples who clashed with Egypt spoke Greek or carried the distinctive emblems of the Mycenaean kingdoms. Furthermore, the Sea Peoples' diversity cannot be ignored, from the horned helmets of the Sherden to the large round shields of the Peliset. Their weaponry, armor, and attire varied widely. If Mycenaeans were involved, they were only one part of a much broader and more complex coalition, not the leading force. Within Greece itself, archaeology also shows that parts of Mycenaean culture persisted, particularly in rural settlements and certain islands. If the entire warrior class of the Mycenaeans had become part of the Sea Peoples, this level of cultural continuity at home might not have survived. Many researchers therefore caution against simplifying the phenomenon into a single migration story. Instead, evidence indicates the Sea Peoples were drawn from many corners: Anatolia, the Balkans, the Aegean, and the Levant. In short, while it is highly plausible that displaced Mycenaeans were among them, the theory leaves gaps. And it is precisely these unanswered questions that keep the mystery of the Sea Peoples alive, a riddle that grows deeper the more we try to solve it. A second major theory has also drawn serious attention: that the Sea Peoples were partly connected to migrating groups from the Balkans, particularly the Dorians moving south during the time of crisis. This idea is supported by both archaeology and emerging genetic evidence. Scholars note that during the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, waves of migration began flowing south from the northern Balkans. Settlements in the Danube Valley and across the region show signs of upheaval, likely caused by climate stress, overpopulation, or internal strife. Amid these pressures, tribes began pressing through Macedonia and Thessaly, moving into southern Greece. Among them were the Dorians, whose arrival coincided with the collapse of the Mycenaean world. This overlap has led many scholars to wonder whether groups like the Dorians not only pushed into Greece but also joined in the broader migrations across the Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence lends some weight to the idea. New post-collapse settlements in the Peloponnese display shifts in burial customs, pottery designs, and architecture that differ from traditional Mycenaean forms. Along the Levantine coast, similar traces appear, styles and techniques that suggest connections to the Balkans and northern Greece. And most intriguing of all, modern genetic research is beginning to add to the picture. Early DNA studies from ancient remains in Greece, the Balkans, and the Levant suggest that during this transitional period, Balkan genetic markers spread southward into Greece and appeared in some Levantine coastal communities as well. This raises the possibility that some Balkan groups not only moved into Greece, but also took part in seaborne migrations that reshaped the wider Mediterranean. But again, problems remain. According to later Greek tradition, the Dorians established dominance in southern Greece after the collapse rather than vanishing. If large numbers had left to join the Sea Peoples, their powerful cultural presence in Greece's later history might not have been so prominent. Moreover, the diversity of the Sea Peoples makes it risky to assign too much weight to the Balkans alone. And while genetic studies are promising, the sample size is still far too small to provide certainty about the scale of Balkan involvement. Even so, the theory adds an important layer to the discussion, reminding us that the collapse of the Bronze Age was likely not caused by one single migration, but by overlapping waves of upheaval displacement, and movement. After considering these theories, from the displaced Mycenaeans to migrating Balkan tribes, many modern scholars suggest a broader, more realistic conclusion. The Sea Peoples were not a single nation, nor a fixed alliance bound by ethnicity. Rather, they were likely a temporary confederation of many groups, each with its own motivations, united by necessity in a collapsing world. Egyptian records, particularly the Merneptah stele and the reliefs at Medinet Habu, describe the Sea Peoples as a patchwork of groups: Shurden, Shekelesh, Peliset, Denian, Lucca, none with a clearly defined homeland. Their weapons, clothing, and fighting styles differed dramatically. If they were one nation, why would their depictions be so strikingly distinct? The most convincing answer is that the Sea Peoples were a loose coalition forged in crisis. In a time when climate shifts, crop failures, earthquakes, and political collapse were shaking the foundations of civilization, countless displaced peoples, from farmers and soldiers to pirates and migrants, banded together in mobile, desperate alliances. These shifting groups moved across the Mediterranean, seizing opportunities, forming temporary bonds and reshaping the political order of an entire age. The Sea Peoples, then, were not one people at all, but many, united by circumstance, necessity, and survival. Those with greater strength or naval expertise naturally rose to leadership, while others joined in the pursuit of new lands, wealth, or mere survival. This explains why, in campaigns such as those fought under Ramesses III, the Sea Peoples arrived not only with warriors, but also with women, children, livestock, and wagons full of possessions. They were not simply raiders or pirates, but mobile migrant communities whose ultimate goal was resettlement. Archaeological evidence from the Levant underscores this, revealing cultural imprints that were far from uniform. Some sites show heavy Aegean influence, others Anatolian, and still others a fusion with local traditions. This reinforces the view that the Sea Peoples were not a single people, but a mosaic of migrating groups drawn together in the turbulence of collapse. And perhaps the most telling feature of this theory is how perfectly it reflects the instability of the era itself. As palace systems faltered and the old world order disintegrated, populations were left unprotected. In such a climate, people had little choice but to move, and in an age defined by violence and scarcity, military force became the only path to survival. From scattered, desperate communities emerged a fragile confederation of the Sea Peoples, part warband, part refugee tide, seeking new places to endure. Such coalitions could splinter after settling or evolve in response to shifting circumstances, which explains the scattered, elusive traces they left behind. For this reason, many scholars today consider the model of a temporary hybrid alliance to be the most convincing, and also why the mystery of the Sea Peoples continues to resist any single, definitive answer. Of all the theories about their rise, perhaps the most persuasive is the one tied to climate crisis, for it illuminates not only the Sea Peoples themselves, but an entire world crumbling at its core. Modern climate science, drawing on ice cores, tree rings, lake sediments, and pollen studies, shows that in the late 13th and 12th centuries BCE, the Mediterranean and Near East were struck by a prolonged, devastating drought. These drought cycles, lasting between 50 and 150 years, crippled the rain-fed agriculture on which regional societies depended. In the Levant, sediment samples revealed drastic declines in rainfall that caused sharp drops in wheat and barley yields. In Anatolia, ancient pine tree rings record years of stunted growth, a signature of repeated crop failure. And in rugged, soil-poor regions like the Aegean and the Balkans, food insecurity must have become catastrophic as the climate worsened. Against this backdrop, trade-based economies and palace systems began to unravel. With harvests dwindling, prices soared, unrest grew, and the lower classes reached breaking point. Many were forced to abandon their homelands, joining mass migrations into a world where much of the old political order had already collapsed. The fertile lands that remained were concentrated in pockets, coastal plains and river valleys, making conflict inevitable. Vulnerable migrant groups traveling alone stood little chance of survival. Out of necessity, many coalesced into armed coalitions, pooling their strength for protection and resource gathering. In this way, desperate farmers, displaced nomads, and unemployed soldiers forged the loose alliances we now call the Sea Peoples. From this perspective, they were not the root cause of collapse, but its inevitable consequence. Yet as they migrated, they became catalysts, deepening the destruction already underway. Cities fell, trade broke down, farmers were scattered, fueling a vicious cycle of displacement and violence. Archaeology supports this reading. Destruction layers in cities like Ugarit, Mycenae and Pylos align with the period of extended drought, and new settlements appear in the Levant at the precise moment palace economies failed. Many scholars now argue that this combination of climate disaster and violent migration was the central driver of the Sea Peoples phenomenon. A world that had once depended on climate stability and robust trade, once stripped of those supports, collapsed into chaos. And in that spiral, the Sea Peoples were neither pure villains nor simple victims, but the most visible embodiment of a civilization unraveling. Yet the deeper we probe into their story, the more we encounter the greatest enigma of all. We still do not know where they truly came from. Across thousands of tablets, reliefs, and inscriptions from the ancient world, there is not a single definitive reference to a homeland of the Sea Peoples. No nation is named. No ruler claims to be king of the Sherdan or the Peliset. No map of the age marks their territories. Why? Part of the answer lies in the nature of our sources, which come almost entirely from Egypt, the only great power to withstand the Sea Peoples' storm. Egyptian records, however, were not written as objective history, but as propaganda. Every inscription, every stele, every relief was crafted to glorify the pharaoh, presenting him as the eternal guardian of order against chaos. In this worldview, enemies were depicted as stateless, rootless, barbaric, forces of disorder rather than legitimate polities. Even in naming the Sea Peoples, Egyptian texts are vague, describing them simply as from the sea or from foreign lands, never with precise geography. This may reflect genuine ignorance of their origins, but it may also have been a deliberate choice, obscuring the enemy while magnifying the pharaoh's victory. Adding to this difficulty, the Sea Peoples themselves were not centralized empires with writing systems or bureaucracies. They left no temples, no royal annals, no archives. Their voice in history exists only through the words of their adversaries. And as historians often remark, history is written by the victors. Thus, nearly all that we know of them comes refracted through the Egyptian lens, a biased, triumphant, and often exaggerated narrative. Further complicating matters, many of the regions that may have been their homelands, Anatolia's coasts, the Aegean, western Mediterranean islands, were devastated during the Bronze Age collapse. Cities were razed and never rebuilt, literate traditions disappeared, archives perished. If there ever were records of their past, they did not survive. This combination of biased testimony and lost sources has left us with an almost impenetrable gap. The Sea Peoples shook the Mediterranean world, yet they remain shadows on the edge of history, an echo we can hear, but a form we may never fully see. Still, if their origins are obscured, their legacy in the post-collapse world is more clearly visible. Perhaps the most striking case is the emergence of the Philistines, a people widely believed to descend from the Peliset, one of the main groups within the Sea Peoples coalition. As Egyptian reliefs at Medinet Habu show, the Peliset were prominent in the battles against Ramesses III. After their defeat, part of this group did not vanish back into the sea, but instead settled along the southern coast of Canaan. There, through gradual adaptation and cultural fusion, they gave rise to the distinctive Philistine culture, one that would shape the history of the Levant for centuries. Excavations at sites such as Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath bear witness to this transformation. At Ashkelon, for example, archaeological layers reveal the sudden appearance of a new settlement horizon around 1200 BCE, marking the arrival of a people who had once been counted among the feared Sea Peoples. Exactly the period when the Sea Peoples are known to have appeared. Archaeologists have uncovered large amounts of late Mycenaean-style pottery, a type widely used in the Aegean but previously rare in Canaan. This indicates that new settlers had brought their cultural traditions across the sea. In Gaza, both architectural forms and burial practices reflect a community whose customs stood in sharp contrast to those of the native Canaanites. What is especially striking is how the early Philistines clung to many aspects of Aegean culture in their tools, buildings, and rituals. Yet with time they blended into their new surroundings, shaping a hybrid culture that merged seafaring traditions with strong local elements. This transformation is particularly evident at sites such as Ashkelon and Ekron, where later Philistine pottery developed into its own unique style rather than a simple imitation of Mycenaean forms. From a genetic perspective, modern DNA studies reveal that early Philistines carried markers linked to Western Mediterranean ancestry, supporting the idea that a branch of the Sea Peoples, the Peliset, played a central role in forming this community. Thus, what began as a wave of violent migration evolved into stable societies that left enduring marks on history. The Philistines rose as a major force in the Levant, often in conflict with the Israelites, as recorded in the Hebrew Bible, and contributing richly to the political and cultural landscape of the region. In this way, while most other Sea Peoples disappeared or were absorbed, the Philistines show us that the Sea Peoples were not only destroyers, but also creators. This stands as one of the clearest examples of how great crises can give rise to entirely new orders out of the ruins of the old. When a portion of the Peliset, part of the Sea Peoples wave, settled along the Canaanite coast to form the Philistine community, a key question emerged. Did Philistine material culture truly carry the imprint of Mycenaean civilization? Excavations provide a compelling answer. Yes, in ways both obvious and subtle. The most thoroughly studied evidence is pottery. In the earliest Philistine layers at Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gaza, archaeologists uncovered large amounts of pottery in late Mycenaean style, especially Mycenaean the Thorisi. Distinguished by complex geometric designs, spirals, wavy lines, and red or black patterns on a pale surface, these vessels were characteristic of Mycenaean art at the end of the Bronze Age. Crucially, these pieces were not imports from Greece but locally made, showing that artisans had migrated and continued their craft in a new land. This was a movement of people, not just the spread of ideas or trade goods. Architecture offers further clues. At Ekron, buildings with open porches resembled late Mycenaean houses. Workshops and kilns uncovered there used methods closely linked to Aegean centers. Burial practices also reveal connections. Simple pit burials with grave goods, tied to Aegean traditions, in contrast to the collective tombs typical of Canaan. Together, this evidence shows that early Philistine life bore a strong Mycenaean stamp in pottery, architecture, and ritual. But within 2 or 3 generations, Philistine culture evolved. Mycenaean the Thorisi pottery gradually gave way to distinctly Philistine designs with new shapes and decorations reflecting both blending and innovation. Architecture began to include more Levantine features, while burial customs shifted toward regional norms. This shows that the Philistines were not passive carriers of Mycenaean culture. They adapted and reshaped their identity, forming a hybrid tradition that honored their roots while responding to their Canaanite environment. Archaeologists often classify early Philistine culture, around 1200–1150 BCE, as Philistine I, the phase most heavily influenced by Mycenaean traditions. Later phases, Philistine II and III, show a uniquely Philistine identity, localized and adapted to its Levantine setting. Thus, the Sea Peoples' legacy was not only destruction, but also the creation of new cultural currents that enriched Mediterranean history. The Mycenaean imprint on Philistine life stands as one of the clearest testaments to this process. While traces of the Peliset, the group that became the Philistines, are visible through archaeology, the fate of other Sea Peoples is far less clear. This is unsurprising, since the Sea Peoples were never a single ethnic group, but a loose confederation of tribes, each with its own origin and purpose. As the Bronze Age collapse ended, many of these groups either perished or were absorbed into the societies where they settled. Within a few generations, their distinct names vanished from the record. Peoples once noted in Egyptian inscriptions, the Sherdan, Shekelesh, Cheka, Denian, and Luka, disappear from history. Yet this does not mean they vanished entirely. More likely, survivors were assimilated into local populations, leaving faint cultural traces. For instance, the Sherdan may have settled in the Western Mediterranean, possibly influencing Sardinia's warrior culture and its massive stone towers, the Nuraga. The Shekelesh, whose name recalls Sicily, may have blended with the island's natives, their identity dissolving into Sicilian culture. The Cheka left a faint trace at Dor on Israel's coast, where a brief cultural shift may mark their presence before being reabsorbed into local traditions. The Danaan, perhaps linked to the Greek Danaoi, likely reintegrated into the broader Greek world during the upheavals of the post-Mycenaean Dark Age. The Luka, tied to Lycia in Anatolia, may have simply merged back into Anatolian society, losing their Sea People's identity. Across these cases, the pattern is clear. Without institutions, writing, or strong governance, their distinct identities quickly dissolved into the larger civilizations around them. Their names faded, leaving only scattered echoes in inscriptions and puzzles for modern historians. When we trace the legacy of the Sea Peoples today, we find not only destruction in ruined cities, but also transformation in blended bloodlines and cultures that quietly reshaped the Mediterranean world. This is why, even after 3,000 years, their story still fascinates. They were not just invaders, but agents of change, migrants whose movements reshaped civilizations. And perhaps this is why they remain one of history's greatest mysteries. Not because they never existed, the evidence is abundant in ruins, inscriptions, and artifacts, but because every discovery reminds us that what we see is only the tip of a much larger hidden story. First and foremost, the origins of the Sea Peoples remain shrouded in mystery. For over a century, scholars have attempted to trace the roots of each group: Peliset, Philistines, Sherdan tied to Sardinia, Shekelesh linked with Sicily, Danaan tied to Mycenaean Greeks, Cheka, and the Luka of Anatolia. Yet no single theory has ever achieved universal acceptance. Even in Egyptian records, the Sea Peoples are described only as waves of invaders from the sea, outsiders with no homeland, no kings, no capitals, and no written traditions. This made them one of the most elusive enemies ancient civilizations had ever faced. Second, the Sea Peoples left no written accounts of their own. There is no chronicle from their perspective, no inscription celebrating their victories, no preserved narrative of their struggles. Everything we know comes from the outside, from Egyptian records, from scattered archaeological evidence, from the ruins of the cities they attacked and then abandoned. Their image remains forever half-lit, half-hidden. We cannot know with certainty how numerous they were, how unified, how powerful, or whether they were a single coordinated force or instead multiple waves of migration layered upon one another. Third, although their impact was immense, their material legacy is difficult to follow. They played a role in the downfall of great Bronze Age civilizations. The Hittites collapsed, the Mycenaeans devastated, Ugarit burned, Canaanite cities destroyed or transformed. Yet once the storm passed, most groups either assimilated into local societies or disappeared from history. What they left were ruins, ashes, and scattered pottery showing Aegean influence, but no enduring civilization bearing the name of the Sea Peoples. Their story is like that of a great wave, crashing against the shores of history, leaving deep scars behind, only to dissolve before anyone could fully record its shape. Perhaps it is precisely this elusiveness that makes them so endlessly captivating. We have countless accounts of powerful empires with palaces and records, but the Sea Peoples are remembered as outsiders, desperate and determined communities whose own voices were lost, yet who reshaped an entire era. And maybe the greatest question is not who the Sea Peoples were, but how history has or has not remembered them. Without the records of Egypt, we might never even know they existed. Nearly all our knowledge comes from Egyptian inscriptions, most famously the carvings at Medinet Habu under Ramesses III. From these sources we have the names Peliset, Sherdan, Shekelesh, Cheka, Denyen, Luka. From these reliefs we see warriors in horned helmets and round shields, as well as families, women, children, livestock, migrating in desperation. Without Egypt's accounts, the Ash at Ugarit, the ruins at Mycenae and Pylos, and the new settlements in Canaan would remain isolated clues, never tied together into a coherent story of mass migration and upheaval. But this also reminds us of an uncomfortable truth. History is written by the victors. It was Egypt, one of the few civilizations to survive the storm, that preserved this narrative through its own lens. In the inscriptions, Pharaoh is always the triumphant hero, the Sea Peoples, the barbaric invaders who are defeated. Nowhere do we find the Sea Peoples' own voices, their story told from the perspective of those who left their homelands, crossed the sea, and fought to survive. This is what makes their tale both compelling and tragic. What survives in the record is but one half of a much larger story. If a chronicle from the Sea Peoples themselves were ever discovered, the narrative we know today could look very different. Yet it is unlikely such a chronicle ever existed. They were migrant groups without centralized administration, without institutions strong enough to preserve memory across generations. In this sense, they are among the countless lost voices of history. And that is perhaps the larger lesson. How many peoples, how many communities once shook the ancient world only to vanish without leaving their own records? The Sea Peoples left just enough behind, thanks to Egypt, for us to piece together fragments of their story. But countless others left nothing at all, their stories buried in silence. This is what makes the Sea Peoples so fascinating. They are not only a historical puzzle, but a reminder of how fragile human memory is, how easily entire chapters of our story can vanish. As we reach the end of their tale, one final question remains. If not for the inscriptions of Egypt, we might never have known the Sea Peoples existed. So how many other histories, entire civilizations, countless human stories have been erased completely? The layers of earth we uncover yield only fragments of what once was. The written records that survive represent only those cultures capable of preserving them. Behind every carved stone, every shard of pottery, every line etched into temple walls, lies a vast ocean of the unknown, perhaps unknowable, and that is why the study of history never ends. For history is not only what we know, it is also what has been lost, what remains buried, and what was never recorded. The Sea Peoples provide one of the most powerful examples of this truth, an anonymous wave that reshaped the Mediterranean, yet left behind almost nothing of their identity. They were not the first, and they will not be the last. If they could transform an entire age yet fade into obscurity, how many others have disappeared without leaving a trace? Perhaps somewhere, buried deep beneath the earth, clues still wait to be uncovered, fragments that could forever change the way we understand the past. And perhaps through conversations like this, through every story retold, we keep these questions alive so that history remains not a closed book, but an open door to discovery. If you too believe that much of the past remains unknown, if you too want to continue this search for forgotten histories and unresolved mysteries, then join this journey. Because like the history it explores, the search will never truly end.